Hi, my name's Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at Trillium. The Jews at the time of Jesus had two ways of describing people. There was the Jew, and then there was everyone else who were called the ethnos, or the ethnoi. And that means Romans and Celts and Greeks and Persians and Egyptians and Chinese and Indians and people from the New World and Northern Germans and people from Ethiopia. Everyone else imaginable in the world. All this diversity was described by one word, the ethnos. We get the word ethnic from it. And it was kind of used in a derisive way, kind of a whitewash of all other people. There was the in-group, the Jew, and there was the out-group, everyone else. And it wasn't just the Jews who did this. The Greeks did this very same thing. They had two words, the Hellene, the in-group, the Greek, and then they had the out-group, what they called the Barbarians. And that included everyone else other than Greek. So that included Romans and Celts and Jews and Persians and Chinese and Indians and Ethiopians and people from the New World and Northern Germans and every other imaginable type of people on earth. There were just two basic groups. And we don't just see this in the ancient world. You know, I had a friend of mine who was at university and was dating this Chinese girl, and he was telling me that he couldn't go home to meet her parents because her parents would be absolutely aghast that she was dating someone that wasn't Chinese. And in Quebec today, we have the Charter of Values, and this Charter of Values is trying to limit the expression of religious and cultural symbols in the public service. And I think there's always a fair conversation to have around reasonable accommodation. But in my opinion, what the PQ government doing isn't that at all. They're trying to wedge people into two groups, the in-group and the out-group. And it's quite divisive and I think really unfair to all the people who live in that province. Who's in and who's out? Who's in the club and who's out? The Jews at the time of Jesus struggled with this. They really struggled with what to do with this ethnos. What was God going to do with the ethnos? What was their discernment around this? And there was certainly a group of Jewish thinkers and writers, and we see it in some of the literature, even in the Old Testament, and certainly in the intertestamental writings between the Old and New Testament, who believed that the Messiah would come, and that Messiah would grab these Gentiles, these ethnos, and he would take them by the scruff of the neck and just toss them out because they were essentially squatters on God's people's property and land. But there were certainly other beliefs, and you see it in the Old Testament as well, and in some of the intertestamental writings, in the Jewish thinking that somehow Israel, the Jews were going to be the first of a very large group of people, that God was starting with the Jew, but they were not going to be at all the end of the line here, and God was going to welcome in all the vast multitudes of all the nations on the earth. There would be just one club in the end, one people, one nation, one community that would be worldwide, involving all people. We're not really totally certain about Jesus' own thinking about this. And the reason we know this is because when the early church started grappling with what to do with the ethnos, or the Gentiles, they argued about this. And had Jesus been clear in his teachings and in his actions about what to do with the Gentiles, the early church would have known how to go forward. See, Jesus' ministry was to Israel, it was to the Jews. The Jewish people had been fractured. A lot of people had been kicked out of the club. You know, the sinners and the tax collectors, the reprobates, the half-breeds, and a host of other people had already been kicked out of the club. And Jesus' prime ministry was to welcome all these castaways back into this one club. What was going to happen to the Gentiles wasn't a major part of Jesus' thinking. When Paul comes on the scene, there's still this argument going on in the church of how to deal with the ethnos, or the Gentiles, and Paul was passionate. He believed deeply and powerfully that God's mission to the world involved all people, not just the Jews spread out through the world, but to all people, and that the death and resurrection of Jesus applied to all people. And that all people were meant, through the death and resurrection of Jesus, to become part of this one club, this one team, this one community, this one nation, all united in spirit and in grace. And that's what drove Paul to go out into that Gentile world, into the world of the ethnos, to proclaim Jesus Christ crucified and risen for all people. And this is a revolutionary move on his part. It transformed the church. See, for Paul, all those common places of division were meant to be set aside in Jesus. So we see, for instance, the common divisions of life: male and female, male, Gentile, Jew, rich or poor, black, white, free, slave, strong, weak, blue-eyed, brown-eyed, blonde, brunette, skinny, heavy, and a host of other places that we divide people on, those were meant to come to an end in this new age that was enunciated by Jesus. And that's why he has filled all throughout his writings with this ecstasy, this promise of the divisions, these old divisions coming to an end. There's a unity now that comes through Jesus. The Gentile and the Jew become part of one. The insider and the outsider, they belong to one club. And I'd invite you this day to think about how in your own mind you're casting out division, sorting people out in your own mind, putting them into the in-group and the out-group by how they act or how they look or how they are perceived socially. As followers of Jesus, we're meant to actually put that kind of thinking aside and embrace instead the pattern and the mentality of love in all that we do. We're meant to extend love in every act and every thought that we do this day. Every thought is meant to extend love to all people at all times. See, there is only one club. We all belong to it. We belong to it because, as Paul tells us, that grace lives within all of us. The divine image, the power, the glory of God lives in all people. And our task in all circumstances is to see it. We looked at this in more detail on Sunday. In that civil war going on in Syria, there's all this infighting between people who are essentially so much alike. It's a tragedy. The Sunni, the Shiite, the Druze, the Alawites, the Christians even, they all are one people. They all share the one identity of being children of God. It's a tragedy when we allow this kind of division to go on in our own lives. Certainly, the gospel calls us to step forward and be that people who unite others into that one common identity. So go forth, do God's great work this day by extending this understanding to all people and seek out the glory that lives in all people. Go in peace.